It was a routine flight from Houston to Seattle. No one on board expected that in just a few short minutes they would witness a moment that would bring America to a halt. In the middle of a quiet, first-class cabin, a white flight attendant lost her temper and slapped a black female officer who had served more than 22 years in the U.S. military, 3 times in Afghanistan. No one said anything for the first few seconds. Then the lights of phones lit up, the shouts rang out, and the silence turned to outrage. But what people can't forget is not the slap, but the reaction of the person who was slapped. No anger, no retaliation. She just picked up the phone and called only one person, a call that was enough to bring the entire flight to a halt when it landed, and make the whole system have to examine itself. The story is not just about racism, but also about the power of calm, wisdom, and dignity when one chooses reason over anger. Today, we will listen to the whole story together, from the fateful slap to the moment when justice was awakened in the sky. If you believe that respect and fairness are worth defending, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to spread stories of courage, dignity, and justice. Now join me in the story of SkyJet Flight 257. A SkyJet Airways Boeing 737 sits at Gate 18 at George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Friday, 7 a.m. Sunlight streams through the thick glass, reflecting off the first-class seats, promising a quiet flight. None of those who boarded that day knew that just a few hours later, everything would fall silent and then shatter. Major Elena Brooks, a black female soldier, sat in seat 2A. Her uniform was neat, her medal pinned neatly on her left breast. She had served 22 years through 3 tours in Afghanistan and was now on her way to Seattle to attend a military conference on defense logistics. Her face was calm. Her eyes were straight. Her posture was straight. The kind of calm only found in someone who had seen combat many times. Behind her, Nancy Hale, the first-class chief flight attendant, was checking the passenger list. The white woman was in her 40s, her hair neatly tied up, her lipstick light, her eyes always filled with a tired arrogance, the kind of eyes one gets from someone who is used to being in a servant but powerful position. Nancy stopped at the name Major Elena Brooks, U.S. Army. She squinted, saying quietly in her mind, "Another uniformed person wanting priority." A message from a coworker flashed on her digital watch. "Be careful, Nancy. There's a female soldier in uniform. She looks a bit overconfident." Nancy's lips curled slightly, a thin, almost lifeless smile. As Elena stepped up, she nodded. "Nancy Hale." The stewardess introduced, her voice formal, but her eyes scanning quickly. "Your ticket." Elena showed her e-ticket on her phone. Nancy stared at it for a second longer than necessary. "Seat 2A, first class." Are you sure? The question was casual, but enough to get a few glances from the surrounding passengers. Elena simply replied, "I'm sure." Then she quietly walked past. I knew if she said one more word, they would use it against her. So she kept quiet. As every soldier knows, not every battle requires a shot. The cabin started. The sound of the engine echoed softly through the steel frame. Elena put her backpack under the seat, uncapped her pen, and wrote a few lines in a brown notebook. Seattle conference. Saturday, 9:00. See you, Colonel Miller. One small detail that no one on the plane knew. Colonel Aaron Miller, her old battle buddy, had revealed that General Samuel Grant, the Pentagon chief, was considering putting her on the Joint Chiefs of Staff Special Advisory Committee, a position no woman of color had ever held before. But fate sometimes tests people with seemingly small things, not bombs, just a slap. Nancy began serving breakfast. The smell of coffee wafted out, along with the clatter of knives and forks and the soft soundtrack of First Class. Elena chose an omelet without cheese, but Nancy brought a tray of eggs filled with cheddar. "Sorry, I asked for no cheese." Nancy smiled, but didn't change the tray. "Once served. We can't change it back. It's the rules, ma'am." Her voice was sweet, but cold, and when Nancy bent down, the spoonful of gravy fell, staining Elena's uniform collar with a reddish-brown stain. The cabin was silent for a few seconds. Ethan Park, a young Korean man sitting in seat 2B, frowned slightly. Across from him, Mrs. Helen Crawford, a silver-haired woman in seat 2D, took a deep breath. It was clear to everyone it was not an incident. Elena just gently folded the napkin, dabbed at the stain, and whispered, "It's okay." That statement annoyed Nancy more than any protest, because it made her realize this woman was not to be trifled with. The flight entered the plateau. Nancy returned with a more professional air than necessary. She radioed the captain about the noise from the passenger in row 2A, but in reality, it was just Elena talking to Ethan and Helen, three people of different ages, races, and generations sharing about society, about equality, and even about the military. Ethan talked about his sociology class at Rice University. Helen talked about her time in the 1968 civil rights protests. Elena listened, her voice low and slow, not escalating, talking about the young soldiers in the barracks, men who still believed in their oath to protect all without distinction. A small alliance was formed, not by oath, but by a sympathetic look. 3 generations, one shared silence. Nancy turned back, her eyes cold. "Please keep quiet. Another passenger is complaining." No one said anything. Ethan was about to open his mouth, but Elena lightly touched his hand and shook her head. Helen smiled faintly and said, "You should be serving drinks, instead of being the noise police." Nancy pursed her lips and walked away. With each step she took, her pride was further irritated. The plane shook violently as it entered turbulence. Captain Richard Cole announced that the flight attendants should sit down. Nancy ignored him and walked quickly to row 2. Elena looked up and calmly said, "You should sit down," the captain ordered. Nancy stopped, tilted her head, eyes cold. "You people always think rules don't apply to you. You people." The 2 words fell, heavy as a stone thrown into a still lake. Ethan looked up. Helen put her hand to her chest. Elena kept her gaze straight ahead. In that moment, I knew if she stood up, everything would fall apart. But she didn't. She just looked. A look that made you see yourself. The plane shook harder. Nancy flinched. Her hand swung out, pop. The sound echoed through the cabin. The stewardess's hand left a mark on the soldier's cheek. A second of absolute silence. Then a scream, a chair knocking, a phone flashing like a shooting star in the night sky. Nancy gasped, her face pale, then shouted, "You don't belong in this first class." The words slipped from his mouth like a knife. No one answered. Ethan was recording video. Helen was holding Elena's hand, shaking. Captain Cole in the cockpit had just received the warning, unaware that the real crisis was right in his cabin. Elena did not stand up. She touched her cheek lightly, then put her hand on her thigh. Her eyes did not look at Nancy, but only looked out the window where the white clouds were swirling like smoke. No one understood why she didn't react. But I did. She was counting the seconds, like in battle, not to retaliate, but to choose the right moment for justice to appear quietly, but precisely. The cabin lights were still on. But no one said another word. Nancy Hale stood there, the hand that had slapped someone now shaking slightly, as if she didn't even know what she had done. Blood rushed to Elena's cheeks, but she didn't move. The silver medallion on her left breast gleamed under the light, reflecting her eyes not angry, just cold. The air was thick. All one could hear was the steady hum of the engines and the pounding of one's heart in one's throat. Ethan Park held the phone in his hand, the camera still on. Helen Crawford turned, her voice trembling. "Oh, my God, she slapped a soldier." Nancy took a deep breath, then shouted, as if to save herself from her mistake. "She made me fall. I just reacted." No one believed it. Elena remained seated, her eyes fixed on the window. The sky was pale white, the clouds drifting by like memories she did not want to touch. "I know the feeling. The moment when someone humiliates you, not just by doing it, but by thinking they have the right to do it. The chill that runs down your spine, not from fear, but from realization. In their eyes, the medals on your chest mean nothing. Elena Brooks, a U.S. Army major who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, was now a nobody, a black woman slapped in the face in first class. She took a deep breath. Through her pounding heart, she could still hear the voice of her old sergeant who had taught her, when offended, keeping silent is not a sign of weakness. It is a way for the offender to hear his own voice echoed. Nancy stepped back, her expression a mixture of fear and pride. "She's not first class," she repeated, her voice fading, as if reassuring herself. Elena turned, looked at her for a second. Not a word, not an expression. Captain Richard Cole opened the cockpit door and appeared confused. "What happened?" "Nancy." No one answered. Ethan spoke hoarsely. "She slapped her." "Sir, I have the video." Nancy turned pale and quickly said, "That's not right." "You don't understand the situation," Captain Cole said. "Everyone calm down. Nancy, go to the back deck now. I'll handle it." His voice was firm. Nancy stiffened, then walked away, her shoes clicking heavily on the floor. Elena didn't look. She just let her hand relax. The red mark on her cheek had faded, but what hurt more was the empty feeling inside. Helen leaned over. "Are you okay?" "Dear," Elena nodded. "Fine. I've been beaten worse than this." The words silenced the cabin once more. Ethan looked at her and said softly, "But no one has the right to do that." Elena just smiled, a short smile, neither happy nor sad. "In the Army, you sometimes have to endure unreasonable things. But I never thought it would happen in this place. I know what you mean. In first class, where everything is wrapped in luxury, prejudice still lives quietly and confidently in its innocuousness." Nancy sat in the back row. Clutching her phone, she texted the chief flight attendant on the ground, "There is trouble. Black passenger, in uniform, causing trouble." But in row 2O, the so-called troublemaker sat still as a statue. Elena looked down at the dried sauce stain on her shirt, the slight slap mark on her tanned skin. She touched the metal, as if to remind herself that it was more than just a piece of metal. "They don't see me. They only see skin color." The words echoed in her head, unheard, but heavy as a bullet hitting the floor. She remembered her years in Kabul when the locals saw her in uniform. They smiled and thanked her. Here, in her own country, the waiters looked at her with suspicion. The plane was still flying smoothly. Captain Cole returned to the first-class cabin and said softly to Elena, "Major Brooks, I apologize for this. I will report it." Elena just nodded. "I understand. Captain, I don't want to cause trouble. But you know, this can't be ignored. Yes, ma'am. I understand. He left, leaving Elena with a silent void. Outside, the clouds thickened, the light faded. Ethan turned and whispered, I filmed it all. I'll send it to you if you need it. Elena looked at him, her eyes both grateful and tired. Keep it. Ethan. Sometimes the truth needs to be told, but not in anger. I heard her say it. Her voice was small, but the words seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't advice. It was a philosophy. Nancy was still upset. She gasped and told herself, I didn't do anything wrong. She looked at me with contempt. I was defending myself. She didn't realize that sometimes the so-called defense was just a cover for the discrimination she had carried with her all her life. Meanwhile, in first class, Mrs. Helen opened her handbag, took out a wet towel, and handed it to Elena. Here, let me help you. Elena smiled, took it, and gently wiped her cheek. Her hand was shaking, but not from fear. Helen said softly, In the past, I kept silent many times when I saw black people being humiliated. I thought I had nothing to do with it. Now I see silence is also a way of participating. Elena looked at her, saying nothing, just nodded. At that moment, no one was an outsider anymore. Inside the cockpit, Captain Cole reported to the control tower. There's a passenger and flight attendant problem. I need to report it immediately upon landing. At 30,000 feet, the plane seemed like a courtroom in the sky. No judge, no lawyers, just the truth waiting to be told. Elena opened her notebook and quickly wrote a few lines. July 14th. Houston, Seattle. A slap. A moment. I realize medals don't protect you from prejudice, but dignity it might make them look. Then she closed the book, placed it on her lap, and looked up. It was no longer a look of resignation. It was the look of someone ready to let justice take its course. Nancy caught a glimpse of it as she passed, and ducked her head, not out of fear, but because for some reason that look made her feel small. I think there are winners who don't need to give orders, don't need to win. They just sit still, let the truth find its way to ring. And it is in that moment of silence that the hurtful person begins to realize that he was wrong. Elena Brooks said nothing, but the entire first-class cabin had turned its gaze. The slapped woman was now the center of respect, not because she was a soldier, but because she had not reacted like a mere mortal. The physical pain quickly fades away, but the humiliation remains, like an invisible mark on the soul, and it is this that fuels the justice to come. The plane continued flying, as if nothing had happened, but I knew from that moment on, no one on this flight would be the same again. That morning, Houston had not yet had the sun. Fog hung low over the road leading to George Bush Intercontinental Airport, acting as a thin veil between two worlds, one of soldiers, one of civilians. Major Elena Brooks stood at the check-in counter, her uniform pressed, her shoes polished so well they reflected the overhead lights. She was used to the passing glances, some respectful, some unfamiliar, and sometimes skeptical. After 22 years in the military, she knew people admired the soldier image on television, but in real life, not everyone wanted to stand next to one. I don't blame them. But sometimes, a woman of color's patriotism makes others feel uncomfortable. The counter clerk asked her if she wanted to sit in first class, since the points are enough for an upgrade. Elena smiled slightly. I just need a quiet seat. Any class is fine. But the clerk still suggested it, as if to show respect. She agreed, not thinking that it would be a decision that would lead to a small storm in the sky. As I waited in the lounge, a deep voice came from behind me. Major Brooks, I thought you forgot how to take a leave of absence. Elena turned around. Colonel Aaron Miller, silver hair, old uniform, gentle smile had been her immediate superior during the campaign in Helmand, Afghanistan. They shook hands, a long, firm handshake, like two people who had survived a storm of bullets together. Colonel, I thought you were in Washington. I just got back from there, he replied, leaning in, lowering his voice. You have some big news coming. Elena, General Grant mentioned your name at yesterday's meeting. They're considering nominating you for the Joint Chiefs of Staff Special Advisory Committee. Elena paused. For a second. All the noise in the waiting room seemed to disappear. She had served most of her life in the military, from her time as a young sergeant at Fort Bragg to her years in the Afghan desert, commanding a convoy amid gunfire. She wasn't looking for fame. But the trust of General Samuel Grant, the commander she once saved from an ambush, meant more than any medal. Are you sure? Yes, I heard him say it. You have a rare ability, the ability to control your temper under pressure. And Grant said, that's what the Army needs. Elena smiled slightly. Maybe he didn't see me on the battlefield in the first few years. No, he did, because he saw me. He believes you. They sat in the corner of the waiting room. Miller said the committee was looking for someone who represented women and minorities, someone with enough experience and dignity to not only be heard, but also believed. Elena, they want someone like you, less talk, more action, and the ability to keep your cool when others lose it. She looked out the window. On the runway, a plane was accelerating for takeoff. The white lines trailed behind her, like traces of her departures, her returns and departures again. I have lived my whole life keeping order for others, but I never thought that order would be challenged with a slap. Colonel Miller put his hand on her shoulder, his eyes serious. Be careful, Elena. When a woman of color steps close to the top, you will face not only difficulties, but also skepticism. There are people who will test you, not with guns, but with attitude. You think I am not used to it. You are used to it. But this time, they will watch your every breath. One small mistake. They will say, I told you, she is not calm enough. Elena smiled faintly. Then I will make them wrong. When the boarding announcement was made, Miller stood up first. My flight is to Washington. Yours is to Seattle. Right, yes. The Army Logistics Conference. Miller adjusted her collar. Fatherly. Go. And keep your dignity. Don't let anyone make you forget who you are. That sentence she had no idea that just a few hours later, it would echo in her head like a prophecy. The gate was more crowded than usual. Elena picked up her bag and walked through the line, each step heavy with preparation. She checked her phone, an email from the Pentagon office. The subject line was simple. Meeting with Advisory Board Seattle Base. 10 a.m. tomorrow. A small line of text, but heavy as a new milestone in life. She raised her head, looking at the screen displaying SkyJet Airways Flight SJO-27 destination Seattle. Everything was normal. No one knew. This flight would become a national hot news in a few hours. At Gate 18, Nancy Hale was adjusting her hair in front of the cabin mirror. She had just received a text message from a colleague. There's a black woman in the first compartment today. She seems to like to show off. Good luck, Nancy. Nancy smiled contemptuously. The kind of smile that comes from someone who believes order is always on their side. In her world, everything has rules. Polite people are respected, and people who are different should know their place. When Elena entered the compartment, They looked at each other for the first time. It was just a fleeting moment. But it was enough to start a chain reaction, like when a small spark touches a fuel tank. Elena did not know that Nancy had been reprimanded for her treatment of special passengers, nor did Nancy know that the woman she was about to despise had the power to reach General Grant's office with a single phone call. Destiny is a strange thing. It never comes with a bang. It often begins with a wrong look, a misspoken word, or a seemingly innocuous gesture. I used to think that the battlefield was the only place where courage was needed. But sometimes it is in everyday life that you are truly tested. Elena stepped through the door, smiling slightly at the welcoming flight attendant. Nancy returned a slightly skeptical look. No words were spoken, but there was something very small, very thin in the air, like a stretched string. The Houston-Seattle flight took off on time. No one on board knew that it would never be remembered for its flight time or altitude, but for a slap that ripped open what had been hidden under the plush carpet of first class. From the moment she left Houston, Major Elena Brooks, fate was in turmoil, not in the air, but in the consciousness of a society where race, gender, and power still vied for space. The boarding gate opened. The automated loudspeaker blared steadily, a synthetic female voice wishing the passengers a safe flight. Inside, the SkyJet Airways first-class cabin was brightly lit, the smell of new leather seats and coffee wafting through the cold air. Nancy Hale stood at the front of the cabin, her uniform immaculate, her scarf tied so precisely it was almost rigid. She had been a flight attendant for 20 years, but she had never felt appreciated. People saw smiles, not exhaustion. And Nancy had learned something to survive in this world. You had to be in control. She didn't like special passengers. She didn't like people who thought they deserved to be treated differently. And whenever she saw someone in uniform, Nancy always had a vague feeling of discomfort, not hate, just a feeling of being on guard. When Major Elena Brooks appeared at the door of the compartment, Nancy saw her from afar. The woman was black, tall, straight-shouldered, and had a calm gaze. Her olive uniform was neat, with a medal on her collar that shone under the light. Nancy tilted her head slightly, her voice mechanical. "Good morning. Your ticket, please." Elena handed over the phone. Nancy glanced at it, pausing for a few seconds at the words First Class 2A. "Are you sure First Class?" Her voice wasn't exactly doubtful, but there was something cold in it, the cold of reflexive prejudice. Elena simply replied, "Yes, I'm sure," without further ado. I saw her eyes, like I had just walked into the wrong place, and I knew worse was yet to come. Nancy scanned the ticket, but her finger paused for a beat, a habit without reason, as if she were verifying something she believed was unusual. Just then, the electronic watch on Nancy's wrist vibrated. Message from a colleague. "Watch out. Nancy. There are black female soldiers in the first compartment. I hear those types like to make special requests. Good luck." Nancy's lips curled up slightly, a thin smile that no one else could see. The message didn't upset her. On the contrary, it confirmed what she had been thinking. She's going to be trouble. In Nancy's mind, trouble didn't come from actions, but from attitudes, the calm demeanor of people who thought they were more important than everyone else. She'd seen them before politicians, businessmen, and now the soldier with the stone eyes. Elena walked past her, nodding slightly. Nancy didn't reply. Her eyes followed Elena's figure as she walked through the narrow aisle, stopping at seat 2A, the window seat, usually reserved for VIP guests. Nancy walked back and checked her ticket again, as if to confirm a hard fact. Elena was already buckled up. Silently, Nancy asked, Do you have the right size carry-on bag? Yes, it is, Elena replied. Nancy still didn't take her eyes off her voice cold. We can help you put it in the luggage compartment if you need. Elena looked straight at her. No need. I can do it myself. She picked up the suitcase and placed it on the shelf. Neatly and decisively, a movement that clearly showed strength and discipline, Nancy turned away, slightly annoyed, not by the words, but by her composure. She had learned that the calmer you were, the more you made others lose control, and she, who needed to be in control, didn't like that feeling. At the front of the cabin, Nancy tried to maintain her professional demeanor. She poured coffee for the passenger next to her, flashing a service smile. But every time she turned around, her eyes would dart back to 2A. Elena was reading a document, her eyes glued to the page. No phone, no headphones. She was so quiet that her presence seemed to silence the cabin a little. Nancy didn't know why it bothered her. Maybe it was because, in the silence, she felt smaller, like people were looking at her without looking directly at her. I know her type, calm, composed, thinks it's noble. But I've been in the service long enough to know no one is truly noble here. We're all guests, and guests need to be reminded of their place. As the cabin began to close, Nancy quickly reported to Captain Richard Cole. First class is stable, except for one passenger who seems special. Special, Cole asked. A female soldier. Could be a little sensitive. Thank you. Nancy, just follow the procedure. The word special, it rang in Nancy's head like a justification for everything she was about to do. She didn't think she was being discriminatory. She just thought she was being careful. As the plane began to taxi, Nancy passed Elena again. Her eyes fell on the medal pinned to her chest. She read the small engraving, "For Valor." Then she pursed her lips. Valor. Brave. She might be brave in Afghanistan, but this was SkyJet Airways, not a battlefield. Here, I was the one keeping order. The flight took off smoothly. The engine hummed softly, like background music. Nancy began serving drinks and warm towels. She bent down and placed the tray on Elena's table. Coffee or tea, ma'am? Elena, just water. Thank you. Nancy nodded slightly, but her eyes lingered on her face for a second longer. Just a second. Enough for Elena to notice. I know that look. It was one I'd seen when I was a sergeant, when people weren't used to seeing a black woman commanding white men. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was disbelief disguised as a polite smile. In the back compartment, Nancy's phone rang again. A colleague texted, "How is it? Has that soldier caused any trouble?" "No," Nancy replied. "But that kind of person, it just takes time." She put the phone down and took a deep breath. It felt like she was waiting for a mistake, a small moment to prove what she believed was right. The seed of prejudice had been sown, and like all seeds, it needed only a little friction, a little wind, to germinate. Up in the air, among the clouds. Nancy did not know that she was about to be the one being tested, not the one testing others. I used to think justice came after anger, but now I understand. It often begins with small glances, where people believe they are just doing their duty, and it is from there that the greatest tragedies begin. Elena Brooks sat still, unaware that she had just entered a testing ground not of war, but of dignity, a silent war, without gunfire. But every look, every word, would be a bullet. The plane reached a cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. The air was steady. Sunlight slanted through the windows, casting a golden glow across the first-class seats. Everything was quiet, polite, and perfectly artificial. Nancy Hale pulled the cart into the cabin, her face a smile practiced over 20 years. It was the right smile, not too friendly, not too distant, just enough to keep people from complaining. The breakfast tray contained an omelet, cold cuts, and salad. Before the flight, Elena had requested an omelet without cheese. A small request, since she was mildly lactose intolerant. But Nancy looked at the request slip, folded it, and set it aside. Everyone has their own reasons for wanting different service, she told herself. But on this plane, I get to decide what's necessary. Nancy stopped in front of seat 2A, where Major Elena Brooks was sitting, reading a document. The light reflected off the silver medal pinned to her chest, a light that made Nancy uncomfortable, though she didn't know why. Elena Brooks, Nancy asked, her voice light, as if checking something unnecessary. Yes, here's your breakfast. Nancy placed the tray on the folding table, tilting her wrist slightly, a small movement, just enough for the gravy to slide down the side of the tray and drip onto the collar of her uniform. The dark brown stain spread quickly, right where the metal was. Nancy made a soft "oh" sound, her voice full of insincerity. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Ethan Park, a Korean student sitting in seat 2B, witnessed it all. He was looking at his phone, recording a clip of clouds, but that moment made his hand stop. Helen Crawford, a silver-haired woman, sat in seat 2D, startled, her hands gripping the back of her chair. Elna looked down at her shirt. The sauce had soaked into the thick fabric. She looked up, slowly. It's okay. I can wipe it off myself. Her voice was calm, no higher than necessary. She unfolded her napkin and dabbed it. Nancy stood there, paused, then smiled. Thank you, ma'am. Very cooperative. The word cooperation came out like a small knife thin, sharp, and full of meaning. I heard my voice in my head, small and tired. Not the first time. Elena, every prejudice begins with a mistake disguised as an accident. Mrs. Helen leaned towards Elena. Do you want me to get a wet towel? Dear Elena shook her head. No need. Thank you, Ethan said softly, almost whispering. She did it on purpose. Elena turned around, smiling slightly. You think so, I saw. Her hand was leaning towards you. Elena was silent. She didn't need confirmation. Silence was also a form of awareness. Nancy returned to the counter, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. She expected Elena to react, to throw a fit that would prove she was right that those people like to make a big deal out of things. But Elena didn't. She just sat there, wiping away the mess as if it were nothing. That calmness made Nancy feel small. She turned to her colleague and whispered, She's annoying. That silent, yet dignified way. Her colleague shrugged. Maybe she's used to giving orders. Soldiers, Nancy sneered. It's okay. Everyone has a way of being taught a little lesson. In the first compartment. Elena continued eating her breakfast. She didn't touch the eggs. The slight smell of cheese gave her a headache. She only ate the bread and drank water. Ethan looked at her, his youthful eyes filled with confusion. I'm sorry for staring, but I could see she did it on purpose. Elena nodded, her voice low and unangry. You don't need to apologize. Seeing is enough. I won't shut up. I filmed part of it. She smiled and whispered, Keep it. You might need it, but not now. I don't want to turn this flight into a battlefield. But there are people who need to see the consequences of their actions, not immediately, but when they think everything is okay. Helen looked at Elena, her eyes looking back at herself from many years ago. She used to be quiet, used to be someone who saw injustice and turned away, thinking it's none of my business. But today, in that first-class cabin, she felt different. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "I've lived 73 years. I've seen a lot. But the way you keep your composure, it makes me ashamed of my generation." Elena replied softly, "No need. Mrs. Crawford, calmness is a weapon I learned in war, and sometimes it's harder to use than a gun." Helen said nothing more. She just looked out the window where the clouds drifted silently, like a veil over the slowly emerging truth. Nancy returned to the cabin. "Are you satisfied with the meal?" Major Elena looked up, her voice even. "It was fine, although it wasn't what I ordered." Nancy tilted her head. "Oh, really, maybe the system is faulty. I'm sorry." Her voice was so soft that it sounded sincere to outsiders, but there was a glint in her eyes like someone who had just successfully set a trap. Ethan turned to Helen and whispered, "Did you notice how condescending she sounded?" Helen nodded slightly. "Yes, but look, Miss Brooks didn't react at all. I don't understand how she could stand it, because she didn't need to win against the stewardess. She just needed to win against her own anger." Captain Richard Cole was on the radio with Nancy. "Is first class okay?" Nancy replied. "Fine. Just a little tense. Some passengers were talking loudly. Try to be professional. Nancy." "Of course, Captain." She turned off the radio, but her lips remained pressed together. Something inside her was cracking, like a brick wall beginning to shake in the wind. Elena didn't know that the two witnesses before her, Ethan and Helen, would be the ones to remember every detail, every little gesture. She didn't need them on her side, but justice, sometimes, needed an observer. "I don't know when this flight will land, but I know one thing: every little thing it makes a mark, and justice, though silent, always has a very good memory." Nancy pushed the cart forward, her heels clicking firmly and rhythmically on the floor. She believed she was doing the right thing. And that belief would be the thing that tripped her up. In the vast sky, a silent war has begun. No gunshots, no bloodshed, just two women. One believes that power is to serve, and the other believes that dignity never needs permission to be respected. After breakfast, the first-class cabin fell into an indescribable silence. The engine hummed steadily, like the heartbeat of a giant sleeping beast. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. Something had gone off track. Major Elena Brooks set aside her tray, opened a small brown notebook, and wrote a few short lines. Her hand was steady, but her eyes were distant. No one knew she was writing to keep calm, the way soldiers hold their breath when caught in crossfire. Ethan Park, a 19-year-old Korean-American, was still holding his phone. He had saved the small video, the spilled sauce, and Elena's calm reaction. He wasn't planning on posting it. He just wanted to keep it, because something felt wrong. Across the aisle, Helen Crawford, 73, folded up a travel magazine she hadn't read a page of. She looked at Elena, then at Nancy Hale, the flight attendant, pouring coffee for another passenger. There was a tension in her gaze between her habit of silence and an instinct for fairness that she thought had been dormant for years. Nancy continued pacing, each step a thump on the asphalt. Elena watched her, not with resentment, but with the observation of someone who had trained recruits calm, cool, and precise. "I've seen her kind on the battlefield, not carrying guns, but carrying small power. And sometimes it's those small power that causes the biggest wounds." Ethan turned to Elena and said softly, just enough to be heard over the roar of the engine, "Are you really in the military?" Elena smiled and nodded. "Yes. Army? 22 years. I think you have seen worse than this. You're right. But here's the strange thing. The battlefield doesn't hurt me as much as the way people look at me in so-called civilization." He was silent. Then he asked, his voice low, "Aren't you angry? If I were you, I would have posted the video online already." Elena turned to him, her voice low and slow. "Do you think anger will change them? Anger only makes people close their ears. I need them to open their eyes." Ethan bowed his head, confused. He had never heard anyone talk about justice that way. In his online world, quick thinking was power. Here, this woman used silence as a weapon. "You're right, dear," Helen interrupted, her voice trembling. "I lived in a time when there were separate bathrooms for whites and blacks. We called it order, and we thought silence was the way to keep the peace." Elena looked at her, nodding slightly. "But sometimes, peace is just another name for fear." Helen took a deep breath. She felt something crack in her chest, an old wall, once built from plausible excuses. Nancy turned back and placed the glass of water on Elena's table, a little more forcefully than usual. "Ma'am, here's water as you requested." Elena nodded slightly, saying nothing. Nancy stood there for a second, as if waiting for a reaction. There was none. She turned away, her lips pressed together. Helen looked at him, then turned and whispered, "She hates you, not because you did anything wrong, but because you didn't give her the right to make you angry." Elena smiled faintly, a smile as thin as the last ray of light of day. "You are perceptive." Ethan leaned in, his voice rising, as if finding an outlet for the anger he was choking back. "I study sociology at Rice," my professor said. "Justice doesn't come from anger. It comes from revealing the truth. I think I'm seeing that. Right here." Elena turned around and looked at him longer. "Are you filming?" Ethan blushed. "Yes. But it's just for evidence. I won't post it if you don't want me to." Elena nodded. "Keep it. The truth needs witnesses, not noise." The first-class cabin was still lit, but the atmosphere seemed to have changed. The people around them, a few businessmen, a few tourists, began to notice that something was going on quietly. There was no arguing, no raised voices, but the silence between the three of them, Elena, Ethan, and Helen, had a weight. It made the cabin solemn. Nancy glanced at them, her eyes a mixture of annoyance and uncertainty. She didn't understand how one soldier could make the entire compartment seem to tilt in his favor just by saying nothing. I do not seek allies, but justice, when it touches conscience, will find itself, like three small rivers, flowing into the same place, needing no one to show the way. Ethan talked about his childhood. His parents were Korean immigrants, and every time he applied for a job, they asked, "What's your real name?" Helen talked about her old black neighbor who had saved her son from an accident, but was later refused service at the restaurant in her neighborhood. Elena listened, without judgment, asking only one question. "Did you ever tell them how you felt?" Helen was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "No, I think, if I told them, they would be embarrassed. But maybe I was the one who was afraid of embarrassment." Elena looked at her and nodded. "Justice isn't just about exposing the bad guys. It's about looking at yourself." The words made Ethan bow his head, and Helen close her eyes. Outside, sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating three faces, three skin colors, three generations, silent and a common awareness. Nancy walked over to pour another passenger a drink, but her hands were shaking slightly. She felt somehow that she was losing control of the atmosphere in the cabin. She whispered to her colleague over the radio, "There's a group of passengers talking loudly. I think they're being provocative." Her colleague replied, "From here. They're just talking normally. Nancy." She bit her lip. Helen turned to Ethan, her voice low but firm. "You turn away. Son, if they try to erase the truth, at least it still exists somewhere." Ethan nodded. "Yes, Grandma." Elena looked at them, her eyes softening. There were no words, but between the three of them, something had just formed a bond that needed no name. They are not of the same skin color, not of the same generation, but they both choose a different kind of silence, a silence that does not bow its head, but rather listens to its conscience. Nancy walked past again, her eyes briefly meeting Elena's. She saw the three of them look at each other, smiling. It was a quiet smile, not directed at her, but enough to make her feel uncomfortable. Not because they were against her, but because she realized she no longer had the right to define normal in this compartment. The plane continued to fly through the thick clouds. The entire cabin seemed to be immersed in a pale white light. No one spoke loudly. There was no drama. But in that moment, a silent alliance was formed, not by slogans, not by oaths, just by the eyes of those who had seen and chose not to look away. I get it. Justice isn't a scream. It's the moment three strangers realize the silence is no longer an option. The engine hum was steady. The cabin lighting was dimmed, a pale yellow covering the calm faces. But beneath the gentle glow, an invisible current began to pulse tense, small and persistent. Nancy Hale walked down the aisle, her smile back. It was no longer a service smile. It was the forced smile of someone trying to regain control. In her mind, she could still see the three of them, Elena, Ethan, Helen, talking and laughing together. Nothing wrong, from the outside. But to Nancy, it was challenging. They sat there, in the middle of first class, calm, as if she did not exist. She, the woman in uniform, the representative of order in this metal box. I realized it wasn't other people's anger that scared me. What made me most wary was their silence, because when someone is so calm in the face of an insult, it means they are seeing right through you. Nancy stopped in row 2 where Elena sat. Her voice was soft, but carried a dry, clipped rhythm. "Sorry, but I have to mention some passengers have complained that this area is a bit noisy." Ethan looked up. Noisy. His voice was tinged with surprise. The only sound in the cabin was the engine and a few distant whispers. Nancy nodded coldly. "Yes, I hope you cooperate. This is first class, where people expect quiet." Elena raised her head, her voice calm. "We were just having a small talk. Perhaps there was a mistake." Nancy looked at her, smiling, but her eyes carried a warning. "I'm not mistaken. Ma'am, please respect my request." The air suddenly became thick. Ethan clenched the phone in his hand, his face red. "Excuse me. Are you saying we're being noisy?" he asked, still trying to be polite. Nancy turned to him, her eyes changing. "Young man, I don't need to be questioned. You should learn to respect the people who work here." But Nancy interrupted, her voice rising a tone. "Don't be rude." The rude echoed through the cabin, falling into the dead silence. A few passengers in front turned around. "Mrs." Helen Crawford put down her magazine and looked straight at Nancy. "You should be serving drinks instead of being the noise police." "Miss Hale." Nancy stopped. The words weren't loud, but they sounded like a slap in the face. No one in first class had ever spoken to her that way. Mrs. Helen did not stop. We all know who is making the most noise here, and it is not these three. Elena remained still. She did not interfere. Her hands rested on her thighs, clenched slightly, just slightly. I know Helen is doing the right thing, but justice always has a price, and the first price is usually the anger of those in temporary power. Nancy took a deep breath. Her cheek twitched, but instead of reacting, she smiled a thin, smooth, frightening smile. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering you," she said smoothly. "I'm just following the airline's rules. We want to make sure every passenger has the best experience." Then she bowed slightly and turned away, but her hand still gripped the handle of the cart so tightly that her knuckles turned white. As she passed through the aisle, a few passengers looked at her. Some shook their heads, others looked down, pretending not to see. Ethan turned to Helen. "Thank you, ma'am." "I don't know what to say." Helen smiled. "Don't thank me, boy. I just took too long to say the right thing." Elena tilted her head slightly. "Thank you, ma'am, but I'm fine." Helen looked at her, her eyes both worried and admiring. "I know, but people need to see that you're not alone." Elena nodded, silent. She didn't need to defend herself, but she understood the gravity of her actions. In a world filled with people who chose to look away, one person speaking up was enough to leave a mark. Nancy stopped at the end of the compartment, hidden behind a curtain. She opened her phone and quickly typed a message to her colleague in the middle compartment. "First class has some nasty passengers. A black soldier, an Asian kid, and an old lady who thinks she knows the world. I'll deal with it." Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from defiance. No one was allowed to make her feel small on this plane. She took a deep breath, fixed her hair, and pushed the curtain aside. Her smile back to premium customer service. But behind the smile, something was smoldering. In the cabin, Elena remained seated. Ethan opened his phone and texted his friend, "This flight isn't normal. Someone needs to see this." Helen leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed, but her voice was clear. "I used to think justice was a matter for the courts. Now I know it starts with how people treat each other, right in the cabin of an airplane." Elena smiled slightly. "And sometimes, I thought, justice begins when we refuse to get angry." Nancy walked past, her eyes meeting Elena's. It was only for a second, but it was enough for them both to know this wasn't the end. No one said anything, but the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavy like the calm before a storm. The plane continued to climb through the thick cloud cover, the light outside the window turning gray. There was no shouting, no arguing, but the confrontation had begun, a battle of eyes, of small power and great dignity. On that plane floating in the sky, one side believes that the right to respect is something that must be asked for, and the other side believes that it inherently belongs to humans. The plane began to shake slightly. The seatbelt sign came on with a dry ding. A deep male voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richard Cole. We are passing through light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Flight attendants, please sit down." His voice was calm and professional, but there was a hint of urgency. The attendants in the back compartment quickly secured the service carts and fastened the straps. Only one person did not comply. Nancy Hale stood at the front of the carriage, her eyes still fixed on Elena Brooks. The dim light made her face look split in two, one calm, one tense. "Miss Hale, please sit down," her colleague said. Nancy replied curtly. "I just need to check row 2A. It looks like the passengers are not wearing seat belts, but from a distance, everyone could see Elena had tied the rope long ago." The plane shook more violently, and a few passengers gasped. Ethan gripped the armrest, his eyes still on Nancy, who was moving down the aisle, her steps halting as the vibration shook. Helen Crawford frowned. "Is she crazy?" "The captain just said to sit down." Elena remained calm. She watched Nancy approach, her high heels clicking against the floor with a dry, steady sound like a countdown clock. "I heard the same sound at the front line before the bullets exploded." At that time, people were not afraid of the gunshots, but of the silence before them. Nancy arrived, holding on to the seat in front of her for balance. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cold, "I need to make sure you're following safety instructions." Elena looked up, her voice calm. "I fastened my seatbelt. You should go back to your seat. The captain just said so." Nancy chuckled, a smile without warmth. "I am on duty." "You don't need to remind me what to do," Elena replied. "I am just reminding you to ensure your safety. The plane is shaking more violently." Nancy bowed slightly. Her eyes narrowed, her voice lowered. "It's funny. People like you always think you know the law better than everyone else." The air in the cabin froze. The people nearby looked at each other. Helen's head jerked up. Ethan stopped breathing. Nancy continued, this time speaking clearly, each word seeming to be thrown into the air. "You people always think rules don't apply to you." There was a moment of absolute silence. The roar of the engine echoed in the background, carving the words into the air. Elena didn't reply. She just looked straight at Nancy, her eyes not cold, not angry, just deep. Ethan blurted out, "What did you just say?" Nancy turned to him, her voice harsh. "You have no right to interfere, Mrs." Helen said slowly but clearly. She heard right. "Miss Hale." "And so did I." Nancy turned back, forcing a smile. "Don't get me wrong. I just meant she should follow the rules like everyone else." Helen interrupted, her voice like a sharp knife. "No, you didn't say everyone. You said you people, and we all know what that means." Nancy took a step back, her face red. "You have no right to give meaning to my words," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan held up the phone, his voice calm. "No need to give meaning. I have it recorded." Nancy jumped, a brief flash of panic in her eyes, then covered it with a stiff smile. "No filming allowed on the flight," she said. Elena looked at her, breathless. "No insulting passengers on the flight. Miss Hale." I saw in her eyes what I had seen in the weakest soldiers, the fear of losing control. And when people are afraid, they start fighting to regain power. The plane shook violently, and several passengers in the back screamed. Lights flickered on and off, and suitcases shook in the hold. Captain Cole spoke over the loudspeaker. "All flight attendants, sit down immediately. We are entering level 2, turbulence." But Nancy stood, trying to keep her balance on the handrail. Ethan looked at her in disbelief. "You're taking a risk." Nancy gritted her teeth. "I know what I'm doing." Elena spoke softly, her voice low and clear against the wind. "Miss Hale, return to your seat. The captain has given orders." Nancy spun around, her eyes shining with pent-up hatred. "Don't tell me what to do. Major, this isn't your army." The words fell, and at the same time the plane tilted sharply to the right. Nancy lost her balance, falling forward, her hand flailing to grab the seat, but missing and it swiped hard across Elena's face. A crisp, dry, cold sound rang out. For a moment, no one moved. The plane shook for a few seconds, then steadied. Nancy froze, her eyes widening not with regret, but with panic as she realized everyone was looking at her. Helen clapped her hand over her mouth. Ethan stood up, his chair flying back. "You just slapped her," he shouted. Nancy stammered. I lost my balance. I didn't mean to." Elena slowly turned around, her eyes calm to the point of fear. No anger, no reply, no argument, just a look quiet, sharp as a knife. Nancy backed away, but still managed to say, "You don't belong here. This is first class." The words uttered in the silent cabin sounded like a sentence to herself. I didn't feel pain. I just felt cold, so cold that I knew if I opened my mouth, I would shatter her with one word. But true justice doesn't require anger. It requires the truth and silence loud enough for others to hear themselves. Elena sat still, slowly unbuckling her seatbelt, but didn't stand up. Helen bent down and took her hand. Ethan was still holding the phone, his hand shaking. Nancy was breathing heavily, her eyes like someone who had just shot a bullet and couldn't believe it had left the barrel. No one said another word. There was only the sound of the engine, quiet as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The plane shook violently. The safety lights flashed continuously, the blue-white light reflecting on the shocked faces. Captain Richard Cole spoke over the loudspeaker, his voice low and urgent. "All passengers, please sit down and fasten your seat belts immediately. Flight attendants, return to your seats immediately." But Nancy Hale didn't listen. Or rather, she couldn't. The wind outside mixed with the pounding of her heart in her ears, creating a muffled sound like metal scraping against the skin of an airplane. She was still standing in front of 2A. Elena Brooks looked up, her face impassive amid the chaos. She had been through more dangerous skies than this. The shaking didn't scare her. Only one thing shook her, the woman's eyes, full of prejudice and stubbornness. "I see it. Not hatred, but the conviction that you have the right to hurt others. That is the most dangerous thing." Nancy reached out to steady herself on the seat back. The plane tilted slightly, gravity pulling her toward Elena. For a split second, her hand swung out to steady herself, but the direction was too precise to be accidental. There was a crack, dry, cold, and absolutely clear amid the rumbling. Elena tilted her head reflexively. The slap wasn't hard, but it carried with it the echoes of a whole history, a history of contempt, of downward glances, of sentences spoken with smiles. Nancy froze, her hands still hanging in the air. The first-class cabin was dead silent. The only sounds were the vibrations on the ceiling and the long, steady beat of the engines. Ethan Park jumped to his feet. "You just slapped her," his voice cracked in the air. Helen Crawford stood too, her hands shaking, her eyes wide. Several other passengers, American, Asian, white, had their phones out, the screens a wall of light in the chaos. Nancy took a step back, her voice trembling. I lost my balance. I didn't mean to." No one said anything. Only the cameras were focused on her. Elena raised her head. There was a red handprint on her cheek, but her eyes were calm, as if the slap had not touched her. She spoke slowly, clearly, without raising her voice. "Are you okay, Miss Hale?" The question simple. Calm was a counterattack without force. It left Nancy speechless. In her eyes, Elena was no longer a passenger. She was a mirror, reflecting all the arrogance that Nancy had hidden under her professionalism. I felt every eye in the cabin. No one needed to speak. The truth spoke for itself silently. Nancy burst out, her voice high and broken. "You don't belong in first class." The words fell out harshly and then faded into silence. And at that moment, every phone in the cabin turned on recording. Ethan gripped the phone tightly, his face pale. Helen just shook her head slightly, whispering, "Oh my God, she just self-destructed." Nancy took another step back, her lips pursed, her eyes darting around. She tried to say, I didn't mean it like that. No one listened." The gazes in the compartment shifted.
They were no longer on Elena, who had just been slapped, but on Nancy, who had just pronounced her own sentence. Elena raised her hand and gently touched her cheek. Then she looked straight at Nancy, her voice low and calm, to the point of being frightening. "You just insulted an officer of the United States Army." Nancy paused. Elena continued, "I don't need to explain. I'll let the captain and the airline decide what this is called." She finished speaking, bowed her head, and fastened her seatbelt as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Her calmness froze the entire cabin. Captain Richard Cole called over the loudspeaker, "Is everything okay in the first cabin?" No one answered. A moment later, Nancy picked up the walkie-talkie and said hoarsely, "I'm fine. It was just a minor accident, but outside, people were still filming." The light from dozens of phones illuminated her face, pale and empty. I once heard it said, when one man loses control, the world does nothing. It just stands by and watches, and justice takes its course. Ethan whispered to Helen, "I wrote it all down. The you people and the slap." Helen nodded, her eyes never leaving Elena. "Keep it, boy. Not for revenge for the world to see." Nancy turned around, looked at them, and said sharply, "Delete it. No one is allowed to film on this plane." Elena looked up and said softly, "Miss Hale, if you want to remind me of the rules, remember that you broke the first rule, the rule of respect." That sentence not raised, not threatening, but made everything around stop. Nancy didn't know what to do. She looked around for allies, but was met with only averted eyes. Even her colleagues in the back compartment didn't dare speak up. She backed toward the back of the cabin, her arms still shaking. The light of her phone flickered with her, like unblinking eyes. Elena sat still, eyes closed, not to rest, but to hold on to her last breath of calm. I learned a soldier does not need to shout to be heard. He must just stand still and let the truth speak for him. As the plane stabilized, the loudspeaker came on again. "The turbulence has passed. You may loosen your seatbelts." But no one moved. Not a sound. The air was thick as if something bigger than a storm had just passed through. Nancy stood at the back of the compartment, her hands holding the tray of drinks, her lips trembling as if she wanted to apologize. But before she could, Elena's eyes met hers quiet, deep, and enough to make her understand. From now on, all her words were meaningless. Across the endless blue sky, the plane continued to fly, carrying within it not only hundreds of people, but also a lesson about arrogance, about the limits of small power, and about how justice sometimes comes with just a slap, and the undeniable silence that follows. The first-class cabin was silent. There was no more arguing, only the faint sound of the engine, like a heartbeat trying to keep the plane calm. Nancy Hale stood at the back of the compartment, her back against the wall, her face pale. The light from the phone still shone on her, cold as an interrogation lamp. Ethan Park sat down,
But the machine continued to record. Helen Crawford looked out the window, her lips pressed together. Elena Brooks, who had just been slapped, remained still as a statue, only slightly adjusting the collar of her uniform, which was crooked. I learned from the battlefield that there are battles where if you say one more word, you will lose something greater than victory or dignity. Elena said nothing. She just took the phone out of her coat pocket. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully. On the screen, a name appeared, General Samuel Grant. Nancy glanced over, stepped forward halfway, and her voice faltered. "What are you going to do?" "You're not allowed to make phone calls while flying." Ethan looked up. "You're no longer in a position to give orders. Miss Hale." Elena didn't look at anyone. She pressed the call button. Each beep sounded, low and steady, like a countdown. A male voice rang out on the other end of the line, deep, powerful, and coldly calm. "Grant." "Listen," Elena replied. "Sir, this is Major Brooks speaking. I am on SkyJet Flight 257 from Houston to Seattle. There has been a serious incident of discrimination against passengers, and I am the one being targeted." There was a short silence. Then Grant's voice turned cold. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sir, but this needs to be handled outside of the airline." Elena spoke slowly, clearly. There was no trembling. Nancy stood there, eyes wide open, seemingly only half understanding what was said. In that moment, I didn't feel like I was retaliating. I was just doing what everyone should do, stopping before silence is mistaken for complicity. Grant asked airline name SkyJet. "Give me the flight number." 257 departing from Houston. Flight attendant Nancy Hale. Passengers and video evidence. "I understand. You don't need to say more. I'll take care of the rest." His voice was as decisive as a battlefield command. Only 3 seconds later, another phone call was connected on the other end of the line. Grant spoke quickly, concisely, his voice low but sharp as a knife. "I want to see the CEO of SkyJet Airways, right now. And make sure that when Flight 257 lands in Seattle, it doesn't move an inch until I give the order." Nancy gripped the edge of her seat. She had never heard a voice with such weight. Elena put down the phone, looked up, and said calmly, "We will land normally. Then someone will come to work with you." Nancy stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You! Are you threatening me?" "Who do you think you are?" Ethan interjected, his voice low but clear. "She doesn't need to be threatened. She just called your superior. If you know who you just slapped—" "Listen to the way the other person talks," added Mrs. Helen. "He is no ordinary person. Miss Hale." Nancy forced a smile. "I'm not afraid. I'm following the rules." Elena looked straight at her. "No, you're following your own prejudice." A moment of silence, no response. The plane continued to fly, but the air in the cabin seemed thick. Even the engine noise seemed to have dropped. Elena put the phone away and turned her head toward the window. Below, thin clouds stretched across the sky like a white sheet. The setting sun reflected off her face, making her uniform glow bronze. I once stood in the middle of a battlefield and heard the order to retreat. Today, I hear that voice again, not for bullets, but for justice. It still resonates deep, resolute, like the beat of a heart that refuses to yield. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Cole received a priority signal from Ground Control Captain Cole. "This is SkyJet Operations. Special instructions from the Ministry of Defense. After landing, Flight 257 is to remain in position and not open the doors until further notice." Cole frowned. "Reason involving military passengers. Very high level. Don't question it. Just do it." The captain turned to the co-pilot. his voice heavy. "Something big is happening. Ben, in the first class." Nancy sank into an empty seat. She looked at Elena, as if searching for a way out, but all avenues were closed. The eyes of the passengers, from curiosity to judgment, were like mirrors reflecting back at her. "The world turns very fast. My boy, Mrs." Helen whispered to Ethan. "Just one phone call. Power is turned." Ethan nodded, his eyes still on the screen. "It's not power, Mrs. Helen. It's real justice. I didn't feel happy. I just felt calm, as if the storm had passed and the sky was slowly clearing. But I knew that from that moment on, no one would be allowed to call us you people anymore." Another flight attendant ran over, her face pale, and whispered to Nancy, "The airline has just received an order to inspect the entire flight. The higher-ups are calling the CEO directly." Nancy did not reply, her eyes fixed on Elena. For a moment, her gaze was no longer angry, but bewildered, like someone who had just realized she was standing on a cliff. Elena didn't look back. She just said softly, just enough for Nancy to hear, "No one wanted this to go this far, but you chose that path." As the plane began to descend, the captain announced, "We are about to land at Seattle Airport. Please remain seated until further instructions are given." Outside, the late afternoon sky was a pale orange, but inside the cabin, everyone felt the light came from somewhere else, where truth was beginning to emerge, and justice was about to appear. Nancy clenched her hands, and Elena closed her eyes slightly, amid the sound of the wind whistling through the plane's wings, as calm as someone who had just ended a battle without drawing a gun. The cockpit was bathed in a dim blue glow from the instrument panel. Captain Richard Cole kept his hands on the controls, his eyes focused on the plane, but his mind was as heavy as the sky outside. An urgent signal came over the intercom. The head flight attendant in the middle cabin reported, her voice cracking with tension, "Captain, we have a serious problem in the first cabin. A flight attendant just attacked a passenger. We have video evidence." Cole frowned. "Attacking passengers, who the victim was a female officer. Major Elena Brooks, United States Army." His arm stopped in midair. The cockpit fell silent. Co-pilot Ben looked over, raising an eyebrow. "Major, you say the military?" Cole nodded slightly. "Yes. And if so, this is more than just a slap." He took a deep breath, activating his internal channel. "Nancy Hale, come to the cockpit." No response. He called again. Still silence. Finally, the chief flight attendant's voice rang out. "Captain, Miss Hale is currently being filmed by passengers. She is not well. I think it is best to leave her alone." Cole understood immediately. A normal service accident. The flight attendant just needs to apologize. But when there is video, and the victim is a military officer, this is a media and legal crisis. At 35,000 feet, one wrong word can kill a reputation faster than a free fall. Cole stood up and handed the controls to Ben. "You keep the plane steady. I'll handle the first cabin." He stepped out of the cockpit, the steel door closing behind him. The hum of the engine mingled with the measured footsteps of a man who had seen too much. He was no stranger to crises, but he had never seen a first-class cabin so quiet. As he entered, the eyes of dozens of passengers turned to him. Nancy sat at the back of the cabin, holding a tray of drinks, her face pale. Elena remained in seat 2A, her eyes fixed on the window. The light reflected off her uniform, quiet but majestic. Cole paused, his voice low and steady. "Hello? I'm Captain Cole. I heard there was an incident. I need to confirm the situation." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Ethan spoke slowly. "We have proof." She slapped Major Brooks. "I filmed it all," Helen added. "It wasn't just the action, it was the words. She said, 'You people,' right before. We all heard it." Cole looked around. Everyone in the compartment nodded. No one defended Nancy. He turned to her. "Nancy, are you sure?" Nancy stammered. "Captain, I lost my balance. I didn't mean to. People just misunderstood." Cole looked at her for a long time. No anger, no emotion. Just a cold look of someone who had seen too much truth hidden behind half an apology. I saw it in his eyes, the look only those who have held the power of life can have. Calm, but absolutely resolute. "Miss Hale," he said slowly, "from this moment on, you are suspended from your duties as a passenger attendant. You will remain in the rear seat and will not be allowed to leave your seat until instructed. All first-class service will be performed by someone else." Nancy gasped. "Captain, you can't." "This is a flight safety decision," Cole interrupted, his voice low, but loud enough to stop any objections. A young female flight attendant stepped forward, gently removed Nancy's name tag, and put it in her uniform pocket. Nancy sat down, her eyes brimming with tears, but no one spoke up for her. Cole walked over to Elena. "Ma'am, I apologize on behalf of the company. Do you need medical assistance or want to file a report right now?" Elena looked at him, her voice low but soft. "No need, Captain. I'm fine. But I think your superiors have already been contacted." Cole frowned. "My superior," Ethan interjected, almost whispering. "She just called General Grant." Cole paused. That name made every American pilot stop talking for half a second. General Samuel Grant, the Pentagon's top military advisor? He understood immediately. This was no longer an airplane incident. This was a national incident. Cole sighed, his voice lowering. "Major Brooks, I understand. I will report everything to the airline and ensure the flight lands in perfect order." Elena nodded slightly. "Thank you, Captain. I just want everything recorded accurately. Nothing more, nothing less." Helen looked at him and whispered, "She has suffered enough. I hope your firm understands that." Cole nodded solemnly in response. Then he turned to the other passengers and said slowly, "Clearly, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. We will be landing in a few minutes. I ask that you remain in your seats and refrain from further communication with the quarantined flight attendant. This will be handled on the ground." Elena leaned her head back slightly. The engine hum returned to a steady rhythm. Nancy bowed her head, her hands clenched in her lap, her fingernails white. "I am neither happy nor sad. I just find it strange. Justice sometimes comes not with the sound of a courtroom gavel, but with the calm voice of a man who knows he is on the right side." When Cole returned to the cockpit, he reported over the intercom, "The situation is under control. Flight attendant Hale is in isolation. There is video evidence of the assault and racist comments. The victim is Major Elena Brooks, United States Army." On the other side, the dispatcher replied urgently, "Confirmed. We have received instructions from the Ministry of Defense and SkyJet headquarters. Upon landing, the legal team and military representatives will be waiting." Cole looked up through the cockpit window. Seattle was fading into the sunset below. He let out a long breath like someone who knew that when the wheels touched down, his entire airline would be in for a big shock. In the cabin, Elena opened her phone and saw a message from General Grant. "I've spoken to SkyJet management. When you land, someone from me will pick you up. Stay calm. You did the right thing." She smiled slightly, a smile so small that it was almost unnoticeable. Ethan looked over and asked softly, "Are you okay?" Major Elena replied in a low voice. Okay, but keep that video. It won't just be evidence. It will be a lesson for the entire system. Helen nodded in agreement. You know, I have lived more than 70 years, and I have never seen anyone make justice appear so quietly. Elena turned back, her eyes soft but deep. Justice doesn't need to be noisy, Mrs. Helen. It just needs to be steadfast. As the plane began to descend, the last rays of sunlight poured through the windows, bathing Elena's face in a soft golden hue. Nancy remained seated at the back of the cabin, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she looked up, she would face the full consequences of her actions. Above, the captain's loudspeaker boomed, "Prepare to land." And beneath the red clouds, justice quietly, steadfastly is approaching the ground. The plane glided through the last of the clouds. The setting sun cast a warm bronze glow over the first-class cabin, making it seem as if time had stood still. Captain Richard Cole had just left the cabin for a final check. It was quiet, but not the comfortable quiet of a normal flight. It was the quiet of a room that had just witnessed the irrevocable. Nancy Hale sat at the back of the compartment, her hands clasped together, her eyes blank. Helen Crawford bowed her head slightly, her eyes shining with the thoughtfulness of someone who had seen the world changed by blood and tears. Ethan Park still held the phone tightly, the video on it like a small fire burning in the middle of the night. In the front row, Elena Brooks remained seated. The medals on her shoulders reflected a faint gold glow. No one told her what to do, but the entire cabin was focused on her as if a single breath could change the direction of the atmosphere. I once promised myself, if justice is silent, I will not. But in the face of injustice, I have also learned that my voice does not need to be loud, it just needs to be true. Cole approached, leaned over and whispered, Major Brooks, we're about to land in 15 minutes. Before we do, is there anything you'd like to say? The airline would like you to speak to the passengers, if you feel the need. Elena looked at him, then nodded slightly. Thank you, Captain. I think it's time. Cole handed her a small microphone that was hooked up to the cabin's loudspeaker system. She stood. The entire cabin held its breath. The ding sound of the alarm rang out. The familiar female voice used to announce the weather or meals now rang out. Deeper, thicker, the voice of someone who had been through war and returned with peace. Hello, passengers? I am Major Elena Brooks, United States Army Logistics Corps. The cabin was dead silent. A few people looked up, startled. Others paused in the middle of unbuckling their seatbelts. I know there was an incident, and there may be a delay in landing. I apologize for that. She paused, taking a deep breath. The light from the window shone in, framing her face like a thin halo. I served 22 years, 3 times Afghanistan, 1 time Iraq. I saw men lose their lives defending this flag not because of the color of their skin, not because of their religion, but because of the belief that all people deserve respect. Her voice did not tremble. It did not eloquently speak. It was steady, slow, and so sincere that no one dared to interrupt. Sometimes, silence in the face of injustice is tantamount to complicity. No one in uniform or out deserves to be humiliated. There was a silence so deep you could hear breathing. Then someone in the middle row started clapping. Ethan. The first clap was a solitary but steady one. Then Helen, the old woman with white hair and teary eyes, joined in. Then, clap after clap. The whole first-class cabin stood up and clapped, without anyone telling them to. Nancy sat at the back of the compartment, her head bowed, her hands covering her head. She didn't dare look up. As for Elena, she just nodded slightly, put down the microphone. She didn't bow, didn't smile, because she knew justice doesn't need ceremony. I don't say this to win. I say this to remind you that dignity never asks for permission. Captain Cole listened to the entire speech through the cabin system. He gently removed his headset and looked out at the sky. That voice, he whispered to his co-pilot, will probably carry farther than any takeoff command I've ever given. In the cabin. Ethan sat down and opened his phone. He didn't say anything, just watched the video being recorded. Elena standing in the middle of the brightly lit cabin, her voice echoing in the air, each word clearer than the sound of the engine. He pressed save, then upload. The caption was just one line, "Respect in uniform." Helen tilted her head and asked softly, "Do you think it will spread far?" Ethan replied, smiling slightly. "I think it has already started." Elena returned to her chair and sat down. Nancy still did not raise her head. After a while, she heard footsteps approaching, not heavy but slow, steady, as if the person walking was not angry. Elena stopped beside him. "Without looking down," she just said softly, "Miss Hale, I hope when you put your uniform back on, you will remember uniforms don't make you taller. They just make you more responsible." Nancy bit her lip and said nothing. A tear fell onto her hand. Elena turned away and quietly returned to her chair. "Some say justice comes from the courts. Some say it comes from the media. For me, it starts when one person dares to stand up without shouting." The plane banked slightly, preparing to land. The lights of Seattle appeared below, strings of light like veins on the ground. Captain Cole announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are landing at Seattle Airport. Please remain seated." No one in the cabin said anything more, but they all knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for a long time. Ethan turned off the engine and looked out the window. Helen placed her hand on her chest, as if in prayer. As for Elena, she closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the plane's wheels touching the runway. Thump. The sound rang out crisp, firm, decisive, like the full stop to an unjust chapter, and the beginning of something bigger. SkyJet 257 touched down on the Seattle runway at 6:47 p.m. The sound was a dry screech to many, the sound of a plane landing. But to those in first class, it was the end of an era of silence. There was no applause in the cabin as usual. No one cheered, no one spoke. There was only the sound of deep breathing, the slight shifting of seats, and the murmurs of exhaustion mixed with bewilderment. Elena opened her eyes and looked out the window. The Seattle evening lights stretched out like a net of stars on the ground. Amid the sea of lights, she saw flashes of blue police cars, media vans, and even military vehicles parked by the tarmac. "I've landed in places filled with gunfire, but I've never felt the air so thick as if the whole city was waiting for an answer from this plane." Captain Richard Cole turned on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely in Seattle. Please remain where you are until further instructions. This is a special request from the Security Agency and the Department of Defense." The words Ministry of Defense made several passengers look up. Nancy Hale kept her head down, her hands clenched white. Elena sat still, buttoning her uniform. She didn't intend to be the first to stand up, didn't need to. At 42, she understood that there were moments when just being calm would make the world right. A group of ground crew entered the cabin quick, professional, and quiet. Behind them were two men in general uniforms, The man in the middle was tall, with silver hair and bright, calm eyes. General Samuel Grant. Cole immediately stood up straight, his voice slow. "Hello, sir." Grant nodded, without looking around. Just said briefly, "I need to see Major Brooks." The whole cabin was dead silent. Helen held her breath. Ethan moved his chair back to get a better angle. Nancy looked up, her eyes bewildered, as if she couldn't believe that the person a four-star general was looking for was the same person she had just slapped. Grant walked over and stopped right in front of Elena. She stood up, stood straight, and saluted Sir. He returned the salute, then said in a deep, warm voice, "Major Brooks, you handled the situation better than any report I have ever read. I am proud of you." That compliment. Not loud, not flowery, but I know it weighs more than any medal. Grant turned to Cole. "I've spoken to SkyJet's CEO. They will be making a public apology on all media channels tonight. Flight attendant Nancy Hale will be terminated immediately, and the entire airline will be implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training." Nancy hung her head, her shoulders shaking. No one said anything. No one pitied her. No one gloated. Just silence, the silence of consequence. Ethan turned his camera toward the door, where the light from outside was pouring in. The reporters were waiting, cameras ready. Helen looked at him and whispered, "Will you post it?" Ethan nodded slightly, not just to expose, but to remind. One day, people will watch this video and learn how to respond to injustice without screaming. Grant leaned toward Elena and whispered, "You know, Elena, this has gone beyond a flight. It's become a public event. The news channels, social media, the entire Ministry of Defense has caught on. People are looking at you as a symbol of silent justice." Elena smiled slightly, her eyes still calm. "I only do the right thing." "Sir," Grant replied, nodding slightly. "That is what makes true strength. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted people to remember when they see injustice. It's okay to be silent, but not to bow your head." Cole opened the plane door. The cold Seattle air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of humidity and the sounds of chaos outside cameras, radios, hurried footsteps. Elena stepped out first, followed by Grant. Flashbulbs flashed. A reporter shouted, "Major Brooks, do you have anything to say to the public?" Elena stopped on the metal steps, the wind gently rustling the hem of her military uniform. She did not speak immediately. Then, very slowly, she said only 4 words. "Respect is earned. Respect is earned. No need to add anything else." The sentence, in a few seconds, appeared on the screens of millions of people in the cabin. Nancy sat still, looking out the window. The airport lights shone on her face, reflecting the image of a woman in military uniform walking between the media fence. She whispered softly, as if talking to herself, "What have I done?" No one answered. The plane emptied. All that remained was an empty seat, a spilled drink tray, and a dried tear stain on the serving board. Outside, General Grant got into the car with Elena. He sat quietly for a moment, then said, "You know, tomorrow they'll be talking about you everywhere. But what pleases me most is not that you won. It's that you didn't let your anger control you." Elena looked out the window and saw SkyJet 257 standing still in the middle of the night, no longer a vehicle, but a witness. Justice does not need to be loud to resonate. Sometimes it takes one person's silence to make the whole world speak again. As the car pulled away from the airport, the Seattle night was thick, but the sky above opened up wide, still and starry. 3 days after SkyJet Flight 257, A 2-minute, 19-second video was posted online with the title Major Elena Brooks, The Calm Before Justice. The poster was posted by Ethan Park, a freshman at the University of Washington. He added no music, no commentary, just a rough-cut Nancy Hale raising her hand. The slap. Then Elena Brooks' calm face as she took the microphone and said, "No one in uniform or out deserves to be humiliated." The video spread like wildfire in a dry forest. In 24 hours, it had 8.7 million views. A day later, the hashtag #MyRespectInUniform was all over Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Ethan never expected to be at the forefront of a movement. Thousands of veterans, service members, and people of color responded, adding, "We've been quiet for too long. We've been quiet for too long." The 19-year-old college student was suddenly interviewed by CNN, NPR, and even the Washington Post. "Do you think this video changes anything?" the reporter asked. Ethan simply smiled and replied, "No, it doesn't change anything. It just makes people look really hard at something that has always been there. I reviewed my video and realized, when justice speaks, it doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be real." Elsewhere, Helen Crawford sits in a small house in Oregon, in the pine forest. On the table is a blank sheet of paper and an old typewriter. She writes, not as a former grammar teacher would, but as her heart beats. The article is titled, "What I Learned at 73 About Justice and Courage." In the article, she recounts that for most of her life, she believed racism was a thing of the past. Until one day she sat in first class and witnessed a black woman being insulted, and instead of screaming, she just stared at the truth. She wrote, "I used to teach my students that courage is action. Now I know. Sometimes it is restraint." The article was published in the Atlantic Online, reaching hundreds of thousands of shares. Many people commented, "We need more Helen Crawford's people who dare to admit they were blind." Helen read each line, her eyes stinging. She understood that. At 73, she could still learn new things, and more importantly, she could still stand on the right side. At SkyJet headquarters, Captain Richard Cole reopened the flight report. The airline had called an emergency meeting, inviting captains, chief flight attendants, and senior management. Cole was asked to explain the entire incident, not to justify it, but to learn. In the conference room, he turned on the screen, showing a short video, Nancy losing her temper. The slap. Then Elena's voice, calm, composed, but chillingly strong. Cole turned back and looked at his colleague. "This is not just an occupational hazard. This is the moment our system lets bias go too far. And if I or you don't stop it, no one else will." The room was silent. A voice from the back row rang out, trembling, "We should use this story in our training." Cole nodded. "Yes, it won't be called Nancy Hale. It will be called the SkyJet incident, when silence speaks." I never thought I would turn a mistake into a lesson, but perhaps that is the only way to redeem some of the honor of this system. Outside, the media was still abuzz. Morning talk shows replayed Elena's speech on the plane. One TV channel commented, "She didn't scream. She didn't demand her rights. She just said one sentence that made the whole of America look back at itself." Elena didn't do any shows. She refused interviews, endorsements, or book deals. She sent only one message to Ethan, Helen, and Captain Cole. "Thank you for watching and not looking away." Ethan saved the message as his phone wallpaper. Helen printed it out and framed it in the living room. Cole kept it in a file cabinet, where he kept his most valuable life lessons. A month later, SkyJet Airways officially launched a training program called the Brooks Protocol Training on how to conduct and handle ethical crises in the air. Cole was chosen to lead the first course. During the opening ceremony, he opened with a sentence that was later recorded in an internal document. Justice flies on no one's wings. It only flies when we all take responsibility. Ethan, 19, continues to attend college. Every time he walks through campus, he sees students wearing little badges that say, "Respect uniform." He no longer feels proud, only relieved. Helen wrote a few more articles, becoming a regular guest writer for The Atlantic. Cole, after 28 years as a pilot, was nominated by SkyJet for Captain of Integrity, a title not based on the number of hours flown, but on how he maintained his moral integrity when the storms came. Justice, in the end, is not about who wins, it's about who changes. And perhaps that flight brought them not just to Seattle, but also brought America closer to awakening. 2 months after SkyJet Flight 257, America still hasn't stopped talking about the woman who silenced the plane. But Elena Brooks still arrives at the barracks at 6 a.m. sharp, still makes coffee with her left hand, and still checks logistics reports with a blue pen like she has for the past 22 years. She doesn't watch the news about herself. She doesn't read the comments. She doesn't respond to interview emails. When people ask, she just says, "I'm just a man in uniform, doing my job." But then, that Monday morning, when she walked into her office, she found a sealed envelope with a Pentagon stamp. Inside was an official dispatch. Major Elena Brooks has been appointed to the Special Advisory Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Signed, General Samuel Grant. She looked at the paper, not smiling, just silent, her hand resting lightly on the words Special Advisory Board. I used to think that promotion was a reward for contribution, but now I understand. Sometimes it is responsibility for the truth we force others to see. The news spread throughout the day. The media dubbed her the quiet major, the officer who made silence a more powerful weapon than pleading. Time magazine featured her on its cover, a gray background, her face calm, with the caption, "Strength without anger." Her email inbox was flooded with messages from early morning. Black women in the military wrote, "Thank you, sister, for making us hold our heads high." Men who served together on the battlefield sent words, "You remind us why we wear this uniform in the first place." A little girl in Atlanta scribbled in a handwritten note, "I want to grow up to be like you, not because you are strong, but because you don't scream." Elena read each line. She couldn't answer them all. She just put the stack of letters on the table, tied it with green string the color of a quartermaster's ring, and kept it as a memory. Then came the invitation from the United States Congress, a special hearing on racial discrimination in civil service and aviation. The chairperson, Senator Michael Reed, a former pilot, who once said the SkyJet affair is not just about individual behavior, it is a mirror of society. The hearing room was ablaze with television lights. Elena entered, dressed in full uniform, no medals, just her unit insignia. Behind her stood General Grant. The audience stood. When invited to speak, she stood, her voice low and clear. "I am not here to recount an incident. I am here to say that respect should not be a privilege. It is a basic right that every person deserves, whether they are a passenger, a flight attendant, or an officer." "Major Brooks, are you angry?" a congressman asked. Elena looked straight, her eyes unwavering. "I have the right to be angry, but I choose wisdom, because anger only makes me lose myself, while reason makes others look at themselves." The conference room was silent. No one took notes. No one coughed. A minute of silence was held like an invisible ritual. I saw the eyes of the men and women in that auditorium. Perhaps, for the first time, they understood that silence also has weight. After the hearing, Elena left the Capitol building as the sun was setting. Outside, hundreds of people waited, not cheering, not waving flags. They just clapped steady, slow, like the heartbeat of a nation recovering. An elderly black woman approached and took her hand. "Thank you, Major. You made them listen by not shouting." Elena bowed her head and replied, "Thank you. But I was just a person who was in the right place at the right time." The woman smiled. "No, you are proof that dignity never goes out of fashion." That evening, General Grant invited her to a small conference room in the Pentagon. On the table was a new project proposal, the Equal Skies program, anti-bias training for civilian and military aviation. "You will be the one to lead this program," Grant said, his voice low. "We cannot let another slap define America." Elena looked at the plan, then looked up. "Sir, I don't want to be a symbol." Grant smiled slightly. "Justice doesn't need a symbol, Elena. It needs someone calm enough to make others believe that it still exists." I understood then justice is not something we seek. It is how we stand even when everything around us is tilting. On national TV, the evening news showed Elena leaving the hearing room, flanked by rows of applause. The reporter said, "From a humiliated passenger, she became a symbol of dignity and reason. Major Brooks, a person who reminded the country that strength lies not in shouting, but in being calm." Ethan Park read the news in his dormitory. Helen read it in a small cafe in Oregon. And Captain Cole, sitting in the cockpit, preparing for the night flight, whispered to his co-pilot, "See, sometimes, just one person keeping calm is enough to change the whole system." Night. Elena is alone in her new office at the Pentagon. Outside the window, Washington, D.C. is brightly lit. On the desk is a new business card, Colonel Elena Brooks, Joint Chiefs Advisory Board. She placed it next to the old, frayed card and whispered, "I'm still the same person." The only difference is, this time, people are listening. One October morning, the Washington sky was as clear as freshly wiped glass. On Pennsylvania Avenue, the American flag fluttered slowly in the wind, the sunlight touching every fiber as if caressing the memory of a country that had gone through many self-reflections. In a small Pentagon auditorium, Colonel Elena Brooks is preparing for the first meeting of the Equal Skies program. On the wall hangs a photo of her in uniform, taken the day she was promoted, not proud, just calm. She sat alone before everyone arrived, looking out the glass door. Below, a few groups of school children were taking pictures. A brown-skinned, curly-haired girl looked up, pointed, and smiled. Elena nodded slightly. In that moment, she realized justice sometimes doesn't need to be spoken. It just needs to be seen. I used to think justice was a judgment, but it wasn't. It was a series of small actions by ordinary people who dared to do what was right when the world chose to remain silent. On the other side of the United States, Ethan Park is standing on stage at a university in California. He is no longer an anonymous student, but a guest speaker at the Youth Voices for Equality program. On the screen behind was an old video, the moment Elena spoke in the middle of the plane cabin, when the host asked, "Why didn't you intervene?" But just turned back. Ethan was silent for a moment, then replied, "Because at that time, I understood if I got angry, the story would be distorted. But if I wrote it down, the world would see the truth for itself." The audience applauded. He smiled and bowed his head. He was as humble as ever, the young man who chose action over shouting. In Oregon, in a sun-drenched house, Helen Crawford set down a cup of tea. Before her was a copy of the New York Times. Its editorial headline, "From One Flight, America Learned to Listen Again." The article includes an excerpt from her own writing. "I used to think silence was weakness. Now I understand there are kinds of silence that make the whole society speak again in a different voice." She smiled softly, her deep eyes filled with memories of a lifetime. On the table was a photo of the three of them, Elena, Ethan, and her taken at the Respect in Uniform ceremony, on IQ, Kermis. An alliance that didn't require oaths, just a shared belief. In the Pentagon office, General Samuel Grant walked in. He nodded to Elena, taking a seat across from her. "Do you know," he said slowly, "after SkyJet, the rate of discrimination complaints in the airline industry dropped 43%. Not because of the new law, but because people became embarrassed to see it." Elena smiled. "Shame is the first step to change, sir." Grant nodded. "And you are the one who makes them see themselves in that mirror?" They sat in silence for a moment. No words were needed. In that silence, there was acknowledgement and also thanks. "I don't want anyone to remember my name. I just hope that the next time someone is being treated unfairly, someone will calmly stand up and say, 'Stop it.' That's all." That night, when the city was quiet, Elena opened her laptop and wrote the first lines for the Equal Skies program memo. A small slap can expose a large system, but what is more important is how people react to it. Anger can shake a room, but wisdom and dignity can shake a nation. She typed slowly, each word etched into metal. Then she saved, closed the machine, and looked out the window. Moonlight streamed in, reflecting off the folded uniform on the chair. The next morning, the news broke. The government had officially approved Equal Skies as a national program. Ethan had been invited to join as a youth media advisor. Helen had been chosen as an honorary representative of the awakened citizens community. And at the press conference, General Grant said the line that would be quoted 1,000 times: "Justice does not always wear uniform. Sometimes it wears the cloak of kindness." At the end of the program, Elena stood on the podium, looking down at the auditorium. Hundreds of people, pilots, flight attendants, students, officers sat silently, listening. She spoke slowly. "As if in conversation, I have learned that silence has two forms. One is compromise, which allows the wrong to exist. The other is calmness, which allows the wrong to collapse. I choose the second form." No one applauded right away. Then one person stood up, then two, then the whole room. The applause was quiet, but it spread evenly, like the common heartbeat of people who had just understood a simple thing. Justice, sometimes, only needs one person to dare to start. I never considered myself a hero. I just stood still, letting the truth speak for itself. When the ceremony ended, Elena left the auditorium. The doors closed behind her, the echoes of the crowd still fading. She walked down the long corridor of the Pentagon, the light casting her shadow against the wall, clear, strong, but silent. In the far corner, a small sign had just been installed, the Silent Justice Hall, for those who choose wisdom over anger. Elena stopped at the sign, smiled, said nothing, then walked away. Out there, the American skies are wide open, and the flag still flies. Silence is complicity. But if just one person dares to stand up, the whole system will have to stop and listen. The story. Flight attendant slaps a black female soldier is not just about one slap, but a reminder that every prejudice, no matter how small, can hurt a large system. Major Elena Brooks did not respond with anger. She chose calmness and intelligence, the kind that makes people bow, not look down. And that response reversed the power dynamic from the one being scorned to the one forcing society to listen. We cannot control the actions of others, but we can control our own response. When you remain calm in the face of injustice, you are not weak. You are taking back control of yourself. Because true justice lies not in the courts or in the ranks, but in how we respond when we are wronged. If you've ever been disrespected, doubted, or insulted, remember, Elena Brooks. Sometimes the power lies not in screaming, but in the silence that makes the world stop. Thank you for following the story to the end. If you believe that respect, dignity, and wisdom are values worth repeating every day, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to help us spread stories that touch the heart, stories that help this world learn to treat people more properly and humanely.